よう、鷹の目。これは珍客だ。俺は今気分が悪いんだが、勝負でもしに来たか。左腕を失った貴様と今さら決着をつけようなどとは思わん。そうとなれば鷹の目。このまま返すわけにはいかねえ。
Hey, my dear pirates. And in today's video, we're going to talk about the supposed superiority that Mihawk has over Shanks. Is Mihawk the one who should be the real emperor in place of Shanks? And the question everyone is asking is Mihawk more powerful than Shanks? Well, that's what we're going to talk about in today's video, but first of all, so if you want to be a pirate king like me and achieve eternal glory, go ahead and press the like button with all the power of your devil fruit, and if you're new here, my dear sailor, already subscribe to the channel and don't forget to activate the notifications bell so you don't miss any new video from Anime Joy Boy, okay? Then join this crew that will dominate the entire Grand Line and the New World. Now without further ado, let's get to this epic video. And well, my dear pirate, with the arrival of the new One Piece movie, the Red Shanks movie, we get to see a little more of how Shanks and his gang fight and use their powers. We can finally witness a bit of Shanks' fighting style by seeing him use a flaming sword technique, and that he somehow manages to defeat the haki of observing his opponents. Basically speaking, this is why they mention as being the haki killer of observation. The fame really increases Shanks' influence around the world, but there is a doubt that is conflicting in my mind after all this recent information from the manga and the movie, Red. How is Mihawk in the midst of all this history? Because if Mihawk is considered the greatest swordsman in the world, having even a higher reward than Shanks, and Shanks, who is already a swordsman, has shown himself to be so powerful lately, do we already finally have an answer about who is the most powerful among them both? Let's analyze all this very calmly. After all, this is a very delicate subject because we have here two of the most beloved characters in the entire work of One Piece. As well as seeing Shanks is called the haki killer of observation for simply not allowing others to see the future using this type of haki against him, and in return Mihawk possesses haki of observation. A great example of this was at Marineford Arc. We saw Mihawk chasing Luffy through all that crowd when identifying his aura, although he couldn't actually see Luffy behind those ships and in the middle of all that smoke. And although we don't know if Mihawk has the so-called advanced observation haki, it's safe to say that like Katakuri and Rayleigh, Mihawk also has advanced gifts of his observation haki, such as supposed clairvoyance, because that's what it says in the databook. That is, my dear pirate, the codename given to Mihawk doesn't mean that Mihawk can actually predict the future itself, but that maybe Mihawk has an above-average ability compared to Katakuri. For example, to anticipate movements and perceive other people's auras. And yes, I know that observation can follow several other segments like seeing spirits, feeling emotions, and everything else. But in the case of Mihawk, I believe that his haki of observation will walk the path of forecast, even though this is not something already premeditated by Oda. Because I believe that Oda only really defined this concept for after Skypiea. After all, I believe that this would have indeed been an ability that would only be used by the people of heaven. So maybe this whole analogy that we're making connecting the data book that says about clairvoyance when mentioning Mihawk is something more connected to his name than actually a skill itself. Just like several other characters have their name linked to some nickname or nickname that, yes, it can refer to a skill, but it's actually more linked to the character's name. Luffy himself we call the Straw Hat Pirate, or as Bon Clay calls him, Mugi-chan, referring to his straw hat, or as everyone calls him, the Straw Hat, also during the work. We have Smoker himself. The name can be linked by the fact that he is a heavy smoker, or even by the power of his devil fruit, or by these two factors. In other words, Mihawk, being a clairvoyant, may have more to do with his nickname like Eye of Hawk. Since the falcon is an animal that has a very sharp vision that allows him to make quick and lethal attacks with almost no possibility of error, so almost one clairvoyant. So if we assume that Mihawk actually has advanced observation haki to the point of having supported clairvoyance, how could Shanks defeat himself from this possible ability? Well, in the last chapters of the One Piece manga, we saw Shanks simply paralyze and destabilize Admiral Green Bull, and detail this happened from a huge distance, which shows the power of Shanks' haki. So Shanks is able to destabilize the emotional of his enemies with his Conqueror haki, imposing his presence. this would be a good way for him to prevent Mihawk from using his own observation haki in a direct confrontation. That's if we take into account that both would be close to each other, so maybe the pressure of Shanks' Conqueror's haki is completely scary, as it made it seem in the movie Red. But we have an addendum here. Would Mihawk, being who and what he is, be destabilized by Shanks' observation haki? Because we know that concentration and confidence is the focus to stay active in the face of the pressure of Conqueror's haki. And as we see, Mihawk is never impressed with anything Shanks does, at least apparently. And after Shanks lost his arm, we saw that Mihawk started to look down on him even more. Sure, all this calm and patience may have more to do with Mihawk's personality than his fighting style. Imagine him fighting a serious fight, like against Shanks! And in fact, I believe that yes, Mihawk would feel the pressure of having to face Shanks in a serious fight, because both are friends and have already faced each other several times. Soon a really serious fight would shake Mihawk, but of course, it would shake Shanks also. So using Conquistador's haki to destabilize Mihawk can work, but that would bring damage to Shanks too. It would be a huge expense of power for him to have to destabilize someone like Mihawk, and that would open the gap for a more different combat and sophisticated armament haki combat. Shanks has great mastery over armament haki as shown during the Battle of Marineford. With his haki-infused sword, he easily blocked Akainu's magma, which is powerful enough to burn the strongest enemies like Ace, Jinbei, and even the Yonko, Whitebeard. But this is where another question arises. Well, if Shanks' armament haki is so absurd, why was it only Mihawk was able to turn his sword into a black blade? Since we are taking into account the ability of Shanks' Conqueror's haki to somehow reach Mihawk, we have to consider that at least in terms of armament haki, Mihawk must be superior to Shanks. Being able to turn a blade into a black blade would not only be a representation of having great power, it would also be about the attachment and choice the sword has with its swordsman. A good example of this is Zoro. We saw how Odin's sword, Enma, behaved initially in Zoro's possession. It always absorbed an absurd amount of haki from Zoro's armament as a way to match his strength. For this to be reversed in power, released in his attacks and cuts. In other words, reaching this level of turning your blade into a black blade does mean that the swordsman has reached a high level of mastery of that sword in question. Of course, this may have been Oda's failure to make Shanks change the color of his sword at any time, but it's also not possible to rule out the hypothesis that he can't completely control his power, or else the Griffin is so powerful that not even Shanks will be able to reach the maximum potential of this sword. After all, he was able to hold back even an attack by Whitebeard with his Bicento that made even the sky split. So who really is the greatest swordsman? Who is the most powerful among these two living legends of One Piece? Well, my dear sailor, let's go for some more arguments. Many people like to use the argument that Mihawk's data book says that he hopes that one day a swordsman will appear who will surpass him and his greatest rival. Shanks to say that Mihawk himself considers Shanks to be superior to him, and well, in this interpretation it is said that Mihawk would consider that if one day a swordsman appeared who was superior to Shanks, it would mean that this person could be superior to him as well. Well, quite possibly Shanks would be at the same level or even superior to Mihawk's swordsmanship level. And I'll explain why this makes some sense if we analyze this dilemma in depth. When Mihawk visits Red and Shanks asks him if he came to propose a duel between them, and then Mihawk replies that he has no interest in fighting someone who only has one arm, this means that Mihawk not only knows that Shanks is weakened, as his dominating arm is not the arm he was left. What it implies is that most likely Shanks was left-handed. For example, when Whitebeard meets Luffy in the middle of the battle of Marineford and realizes that our dear protagonist is wearing Shanks' precious straw hat, he remembers his old son, and how we can see, once again, Shanks holding his sword in the left hand. Before that, when Edward Newgate talks to Shanks and there's a flashback moment there, he remembers both Shanks and the younger Buggy. We can clearly see Shanks holding the sword in his left hand. And as if that wasn't enough, there is another memory moment, this time with Buggy. He remembers his past with Shanks, and we can clearly see both of them as a child, and again Shanks appears drawing his sword with his left hand. And if we stop to think about it, Shanks to this day continues to keep his sword always kept on the right side, which is the drawing side for a left-hand swordsman, isn't it? The fact that Mihawk doesn't want to face Shanks and even mistreat him every time they meet again indicates that yes, Shanks lost a good part of his fencing domain after having to fight with his arm, not dominant, which is the left arm. This could also be the ultimate answer to the fact that Shanks was never able to turn the griffin into a black blade, or perhaps never managed to use his sword's full potential, hypothetically speaking. In other words, my dear sailors, definitely Mihawk mocking Shanks or even avoiding conflicts with him can indicate a certain degree of respect from Mihawk towards his friend who can no longer use his full potential. So it's possible that yes, Shanks was even more talented than Mihawk at the time that Mihawk saw him as someone to be overcome, but that currently is no longer a reality. So to finish, it's very difficult for us not to see Shanks as someone really more powerful than Mihawk, even because Oda always seems to reinforce this, whether with some actions in the manga and even in movies, as in the case of the current Red film. But when we talk about being a swordspath, well, then there's no way to see Mihawk being below Shanks, even though many think Shanks is not classified that way, which is a mistake in my opinion. Even though Shanks has lost his most proficient arm, and he is no longer the same as in the past as we theorized in today's video, it's not possible to say that Shanks doesn't classify himself as a swordsman, given that Shanks' fighting style fits perfectly in it, even more so after Film Red. Soon, it is almost blasphemous to say that Mihawk is superior to Shanks, at least in terms of power, but as a swordsman, at least in that category, it would be no lie to say that for now, as far as we can tell, Mihawk is still higher. But the question I ask you is, how long will this superiority be maintained? Zoro is evolving a lot, and it can happen anytime. Shanks shows the blackened griffin with his haki, demonstrating that he finally managed to use his full power or the full potential of his sword. So definitely saying that compared to haki, Shanks is far superior to Mihawk, but as a swordsman, Mihawk stands as the greatest. So what do you think about it? But of course, if you made it this far, it's because you like the content, so it doesn't hurt to subscribe to our channel and become one more member of our fleet, my dear sailor. And of course, do not forget to press the like button, that helps a lot in spreading the video and the channel. So help us to become the largest fleet of pirates here on YouTube, okay? A big hug for everyone, and until the next video,